to assist with what information we present in curriculum for occupational therapy students, and really to identify some research gaps and priorities for research. And you'll be able to see that we've got, from an occupational therapy perspective, like many professions, we have a research gap. We have lots of gaps we need to fill in. But externally, we really want external agencies to use this document to help them understand what the scope of OT is and the benefits are and the need for occupational therapy is. I think that if you look nationally at what many feel the scope is for occupational therapy for individuals with autism, it's really focused in young children on sensory motor aspects. In schools, oftentimes it's really some of the more academic, handwriting, adaptive kind of skills, behavior regulation kinds of things. And in pre-voc, whether it be pre-vocational or in vocational work placements, to really address some of the motor aspects or sensory motor components. I think our scope, and when you look at the research questions from an OT standpoint, I want to make the argument that we also have a lot to offer from a social participation standpoint. So these evidence-based practices, I think that we have to consider a number of factors in what we consider the evidence-based practice. We are all practitioners. We all have kind of our own clinical experience and experiences we bring. We have multiple client factors and preferences in the environment we work in that we'll have to consider. Then we've got this available evidence, and together what that does is that helps us understand what evidence-based practice is and how we make evidence-based decisions. Okay, so AOTA has this whole practice guideline series, and some of them are missing on here. And so individuals with work-related injuries, children and adolescents with sensory processing disorders, home modifications. Here's the new autism spectrum disorder guideline. I'm going to restart my camera.
Click right there. Click the exit. The exit. Yeah. You'll start it. You'll start it.
All right, so we're having some camera issues. We're gonna work through those, and I'm gonna keep rolling if I can. So if we look at what's all in this guideline, there's lots more evidence, lots more information than we're going to go over this afternoon. We are going to really focus on what the literature tells us in the systematic review, give an overview of some of the highlighted considerations for evaluation and intervention, and then try to apply that kind of overview to looking at cases to really help us illustrate those pieces. So if we look at the first guideline to this guideline, there's a couple of things that are very different that were important. So in the first, you'll notice we limited the guideline to children and adolescents. This time we've taken a whole lifespan focus. And so Christy and I were a great team in that most of my practice goes through adolescents. Christy, however, works with adolescents through adult. And so we were a great partnership to get this guideline done. We also really focused and tried to ensure that we had a strong self-advocate contribution. And so not only did we have self-advocates review, comment, but we also had self-advocates contribute to the writing. And one of my favorite parts of the book is this DSM-5 reconfiguration from Nick Penzel. So if you look at this table snapshot I have on the slide, in the first column you'll see the diagnostic criteria. So what DSM-5 says about and is their condition for diagnosis. The middle column are behavioral exemplars. So what we may see in practice or what you may observe when watching a child. The third column is how Nick, an adult with autism, how he would describe and conceptualize that diagnostic criteria. And I think it's important. It's a really important consideration. It really gives us insight into how we look at these factors. So if we look at hyper or hypo-responsivity as the diagnostic criteria, we may see that as a child squinting their eyes to lights, or differential responding to sounds, hyper focus or persistent focus on one type of sensory input. Nick may describe that as visual fascination with lights, movement, which here is where the big ticket and understanding for us is as a coping strategy. And so instead of it being a difference that we need to fix or address with intervention, instead a self-advocate tells us that many of these features that we may be concerned about in classrooms, on the work site, out in the community, or in the clinic are really coping strategy. We may not want to address them from a extinguish or remove them standpoint. This guideline also has an infusion of strengths, and so we take a really strengths-based perspective in our writing. If you look at even our behavioral exemplars in the table, so we don't use words like restricted, repetitive pattern of behavior. We describe behavior as we see it. So squinting eyes when looking at objects. We don't say light sensitivity and leave it at that because we don't have a full understanding. We can only theorize as to why. I want us to just spend a few minutes talking about the systematic reviews that were done. A previous systematic review was done by Jane K. Smith. I want to acknowledge her and her efforts. That review really conducted time period 86 to 2006. The most recent review included articles since that time through April of 2013. And there were 4 primary questions within the scope of occupational therapy. And you'll see that those questions relate to social participation, sensory processing. There was an occupation-based question that looked at activities of daily living, work, pre-vocational, and then there was what we'll call a family question. Really looked at parent stress, parent resiliency. So we'll call that one the family question. And the systematic reviews included levels of evidence 1, 2, and 3 primarily, and levels 4 and 5 were only included when other levels of evidence at a higher level were not included, okay, or not found, I should say. That piece is cut out. You can see there were over 18,000 citations. In the end, there were 151 articles that met all of the inclusion criteria. Other inclusion criteria available in English, and some of those factors. So 151 of the articles. By way of review, again, levels 1, 2, and 3, either a systematic review or a randomized controlled trial. Level 2 being a 2-group non-randomized study. Level 3 being a 1-group non-randomized. Level 4 being a single subject design or case series, level 5 being a case report. Again, 4 and 5 only included if nothing else, and 1, 2, and 3 were available. For each of these areas, we're gonna talk about and have really 3 primary slides or 4 primary slides. What the question was, what interventions were investigated or studied, what was the available evidence and at what levels, and then what's the bottom line. The guideline has all evidence-based tables included, has narrative summary of all of this data. But for today, we're just going to focus on what the bottom line is. What are the big picture things that we can apply to a couple cases? Okay, so what is the effectiveness of interventions within the scope of OT to improve social interaction, restrictive and repetitive behaviors, play performance, and leisure, okay, in individuals? And so the interventions that were targeted fell into those 4 main categories. So from a social standpoint, we looked at using special interests and preferred interests as an intervention, peer groups, peer-mediated activities or activity-based groups, computer-based training for social skill, whether that be video modeling or virtual reality or other computer-based software to build social skill, and Carol Gray's social stories. In contrast to social communication, and you'll see I tried to shadow the communication because these really are communication interventions, and so interventions to build communication skill in individuals. Okay, and here some of the interventions that were investigated were the picture exchange communication system, naturalistic behavioral interventions like pivotal response training or Milieu therapy, developmental therapies like floor time, DIR, classroom-based interventions like TEACH, parent-mediated programs, sensory motor programs like sensory motor groups as an example, imitation programs, or joint attention interventions. Many of these were Connie Kasari's work out of Vanderbilt looking at joint attention routines. Third category, interventions targeting restricted and repetitive behavior. Kata training was one of the interventions that came here. Kata training is a precursor to Taekwondo and Karate. School-based interventions, exercise, self-management, and the last area being play and leisure. So using which interventions can be effective to build those skills. This is the area of evidence from a social question or social participation where there is the most evidence as we go through. So there were 48 level 1 articles. A lot of it is peer group training, picture exchange communication system. Level 2 evidence, we see some activity or computer-based leisure group. Level 3, Early Start Denver is represented there. Play Project, Solomon, Stronger Families. WESP is a water exercise swim program. And so these are all really areas of interest. And if we look at what the bottom line is for social, it's hard to represent the literature here because there was so much literature. But to try to summarize in one slide, bottom line, down and dirty, what I want you to know is that from a social participation standpoint, there's strong evidence that peer groups are effective in building social skill. And there's strong evidence to support the picture exchange communication system and joint attention routines or joint attention interventions to build communication. There's also a lot of evidence, moderate evidence, to support many other activities. So activity-based interventions, So Lego groups here was an example. So some of the Legoff studies. Another constructive play task, activity-based. Computer-based interventions also were effective. Virtual reality and video modeling are represented here primarily, but there was mixed results, again, for social skill, for social stories, or peer-mediated interventions. And I think here's where it's important to point out that we're really targeting social skill. We're not making the statement that the evidence is mixed for social stories globally, just social stories to develop social skill. Social stories are used primarily as an antecedent intervention to really target and prevent a behavior. So we use them, we use social stories a lot of times to tell the child what to do, so to prevent the behavior from happening. So you'll see that social stories did have stronger evidence for other areas in this evidence-based review, just not for building social. And you'll see down below, for building play interaction and leisure, social stories have been found to be evidence-based. Okay. If we look at communication intervention, many of the interventions that we use with young children early on, there's moderate evidence to support. So things like milieu therapy, things like pivotal response training or incidental teaching, which would fall in that naturalistic. DIR floor time in the developmental or early start Denver model. There's also moderate support for parent-mediated interventions, and I think here's where many of the services we provide as early childhood providers through coaching need to be highlighted. If we're effectively coaching families in these strategies, many of the imitation interventions that there's moderate evidence for as well really are implemented by parents. And so parent-mediated interventions have been effective in building the communication skill. From reducing a restricted and repetitive pattern of behavior, that precursor to karate, kata training, multiple school interventions. A lot of these were single subject design case reports, so looking at, again, many antecedent-based interventions, so using visual supports, using visual schedules, using time timer, using some of these strategies that we use to kind of prevent behavior. There was moderate evidence to support their use, as was exercise. And I think oftentimes we fade some of those visual supports as individuals get older and really target self-management routines, and that showed up here in the literature as well. So that self-management was moderate evidence to support those as well. From a play-leisure standpoint, recess groups, other leisure groups, the swim program, and social stories. There was moderate evidence to support their use, whereas there was not enough support in adult modeling to build play-leisure, or social pragmatic groups, floor time, or child-led play. So a lot of times if you look at the way some interventions are described, they may not be a manualized intervention, but you'll read in reports that I'm following the child's lead and building skill. So that's a fundamental principle to the play project. It's a fundamental principle to DIR floor time. And interventions standing alone didn't build play skill. Okay. If we look at the sensory question, this is one that's is really a hotbed if you're an occupational therapist. Much debate in our profession about sensory integration and that specific intervention. And it's important to separate what sensory integration means. So AIR's sensory integration is a manualized intervention, as opposed to sensory-based interventions, which are interventions that are focused on a sensory system or multiple sensory systems, and that'll become clearer in a minute. And what this question wanted to do was outline the evidence for AIR's sensory integration and other sensory-based interventions to improve adaptive skill, occupational performance in children with ASD. So again, if we look at a couple of, trying to break down that continuum, if we look at AIRS sensory integration, AIRS sensory integration now is really a manualized intervention. So there's a manual with a fidelity measure, requires like 26 pieces of equipment, clinic site, yada, yada, yada. I mean, it's that fidelity. So it means something very different than sensory-based interventions, non-manualized, targeted sensory skills. So things like in classrooms where we use dynamic seating or we use a weighted vest. Some of the other interventions you'll see in other category. One study investigated using linear movement, whether it be on a swing or bouncing on a ball, while having a story read. Wilbarger brushing protocol we see used often. There was a study that was included. There was one, it was a level 3 or 4, we'll see in a minute, that looked at modifying the sensory environment. I know we've got a couple of OTs on today that are school-based, and so there was one study that looked at soundproofing walls and lighting changes in school classroom and what was the impact of that on performance for academic tasks. If we look at the evidence here, stark contrast to what we saw in social. So here we have, a total of 11 studies of 1, 2, and 3, and then because we don't have good evidence, we don't have a whole lot of evidence, we had to include a lot of level 4s in this group. And so this is an intervention category that many occupational therapists really hang their hat on. This is what the profession in pediatric world anyway really focuses on, but we don't have really good evidence to support what we're doing yet. So hopefully we're moving in the right direction. So you can see where the evidence lies here. If we look at what the bottom line is for the sensory question, we can say that there was moderate evidence to support. So there was 2 randomized controlled trials that supported use of AIRS sensory integration, but only if it was targeting individual goal areas established by the parents and goal attainment scaling was used as the outcome measure. Other measures, other areas that were addressed, so sleep, there was an autism severity rating in multiple studies, no impact. Sleep, no impact. Sensory reactivity on a parent report measure, no difference. Adaptive skill on a Vineland or an ABAS, no different. And so the scope of what is considered, there's evidence to support for an AIRS sensory integration is pretty narrow at this time. If we look at sensory-based interventions, there was moderate evidence to support multisensory activities to improve occupational performance and behavior regulation. And so sensory motor groups or multisensory activities helped build participation and engagement and attention primarily in a number of environments, both on work sites and at school. However, the evidence was limited for other single sensory interventions. So weighted vests, dynamic seating, all of those sound therapies, so listening therapies, there's not evidence right now to support their use from a sensory perspective. Again, specific to autism. Before I get a chat comment, so there have been a couple of systematic reviews done recently for children with ADHD. So the evidence there has been supportive of use weighted vests to build attention and engagement. So different for individuals with autism. Okay. Here's another one of our wheelhouse areas. I think that as occupational therapists, we look at daily functioning, look at activities of daily living, instrumental ADLs, so kind of those higher level meal prep, laundry kind of things, cooking, and education programs. And so what's the evidence to support our use? And if we look at the interventions that targeted, we looked at work. Here we looked at video modeling and supported employment, so technology enhanced interventions and supported employment. ADL and IADL activities, education, looked at exercise and movement activities primarily within the framework of education to help build that independence. Unfortunately, there was really no studies addressing sleep. And I think that it's an area of intervention that's new. We're starting to see at recent like International Meeting for Autism Research, IMFAR meetings at our national conference as well, AOTA, we're starting to see occupational therapists consult and work with families to really help establish sleep routines, use some of the strategies to help with sleep. High percentage of children have sleep differences, sleep difficulties, and so this will be an emerging area of practice. But right now, there's no studies, so we will not have a bottom line as it relates to sleep. We'll have to target on work, ADLs, and education. Okay. So again, much less evidence in this area when it's considered a primary practice area for occupational therapists. Just goes to show that we have a lot of work to do in this area. If we look at work, there's really strong evidence to support technology and in particular video modeling, virtual reality mechanisms to help with teaching employment-related skills and tasks, and also the use of technology for self-monitoring. So whether we're using your cell phone or handheld device to really help with self-monitoring, keep yourself on task, give yourself deadlines, show progression of time. So all of those technology-enabled factors have been found to be helpful. There was limited evidence for supported employment. And in large part, it's not saying that supported employment was not effective. It's that the literature that we had available in the evidence-based review was of level 4. And so a lot of them were single subject design models or single subject design studies that pulled together a number of single subject designs. And so we need to just ramp up that level of evidence to show that the good work we do from a supported employment standpoint truly is effective with larger scale studies, randomization, two-group designs. Okay. There's moderate evidence to support really cognitive behavioral interventions to address both parent and child goals. And so here a co-op method is used in which individuals really pick a goal area, and there's task analysis and really cognitive behavioral measures put in place to really improve skills. And there was some evidence to support cognitive behavioral methods as well to improve eating. If we look at education, there's evidence here to initially support some jogging and yoga, but again, it was lower level evidence. And so while many classrooms are now using movement-based activities to help build attention, higher level of research evidence is needed in this area, as is many of the other interventions we talked about. If we look at the family question, we're trying to get at how empowered families feel. What are their coping strategies? How resilient are they? What's parent stress like? Do our interventions really help with parent stress? And so we looked at parent training programs, providing parent education and coaching, behavioral interventions, so some, again, cognitive behavioral methods, and then there were some other interventions. And really, if we drill down, what we did in the guideline is kind of restructure this evidence because we felt like the core areas really targeted parent self-efficacy, quality of life, and family kind of participation issues. Okay, so if we look at the evidence and how the evidence fell out, there were a lot of parent-focused interventions. So the interventions that really focused on the mom, dad, and building their self-efficacy their confidence, their coping, stress reduction in these factors. Behavioral interventions also address those, and then there were a couple of really other group-based studies. And if we look at the evidence for these studies from a parent training, and I'm just going to go to the bottom line actually to keep moving us along. There was really moderate evidence to support parent training, education, and coaching to build self-efficacy and competence and confidence. But these were not effective in reducing parent stress. So quality of life improved. Parents felt like they were more empowered to address their child's performance, build skills, but their stress didn't reduce. There was moderate to strong evidence to support the use of behavioral intervention programs as well to address these. But again, even the behavioral interventions did not reduce parent stress. So mindfulness, relaxation training, there was limited use for that. This may be another area in which we need to focus some additional literature. So here, bottom line, many of our interventions really help parents feel empowered, help them address, feel competent in addressing their child's areas. However, didn't reduce their stress. Okay, so we'll have to keep looking at those other areas. The occupational therapy process is really not that much different than a typical model of how we gather information. So we get a referral, we evaluate, we provide some intervention, and then at some point we discharge, we discontinue services. Specific to evaluation, in occupational therapy, we really look at this person-environment-occupation interaction and look at which areas of occupation are important to that child, that individual. If they're in the work site, the occupations they're engaging in are going to be very different than the preschooler in a preschool environment. And it's that interaction between the environment, their current skills, their performance patterns, that really leads to how able they are to participate in that environment and include the goals.